Welcome to Film in 5D, the show about everything film with the Sony a7s. I'm your host, Aaron Hammock, and I'm here in the studio today to show you guys some of my brand new lenses for this camera. So like I said last episode, we're planning to change the format of the show, which is why Colton isn't actually here today with me. We're going to be doing a 30-minute weekly podcast for you guys to download on iTunes or watch right here on YouTube. However, I did get some suggestions to kind of mix it up once in a while, which is why I will still be doing these full studio episodes when I have something important to show you guys. I'm actually recording this on the GH4 right now, which I'm going to be doing a review on next month. The topic of this episode is actually going to be about the relatively new Sony-Zeiss FE lenses. I'm going to be showing you what I think about the current ones available and give you some of the detailed specs as well as best uses, so that anyone looking to take the plunge into full-frame mirrorless knows what to expect. There are currently 5 Sony full-frame E-mount lenses available, with many more to come in the coming year. 3 of these lenses are the top-of-the-line Sony Zeiss lenses, a 24-70 zoom, a 35 prime, and a 55 prime. There's also a 70-200 telephoto lens available for photography, as well as a much cheaper 24-70 kit lens. But today I'll be showing you the 3 Zeiss ones I bought, which unfortunately are much more expensive than I'm used to with Canon, but I'm also much more happy with these lenses than my old Canon glass. These are a perfect match for an already relatively tiny camera, plus they're tack sharp, they're amazingly detailed with my Sony a7s, which is just awesome. So let me give you a brief overview of these lenses with the positives and negatives I found while using them. So let's start with the Zeiss 55mm prime. This is actually the sharpest lens I've ever used, and that's including my 50mm 1.4 from Canon, which was previously my sharpest. It's the perfect focal length for video. I mean, that 50 to 55mm range. It gives kind of the best natural look, and it's kind of the baseline that you want to use on a full frame sensor, and especially with the framing and everything else. And I would definitely recommend it as a starter lens for basically any full frame user, that 50mm range. And it's the right price, unlike the other two. And this one's $1,000, which seems expensive, but for the image quality you get out of it, it's amazing. And the size of it as well. It has that Zeiss pop. Like, actually, all 3 of these lenses I'm going to be talking about today have the Zeiss pop. It's basically kind of a 3D effect that you get with only the Zeiss lenses, and that's why a lot of people like the Zeiss lenses. The one negative I have about this is it's actually pretty long for a 50mm, 55mm. It kind of looks like a telephoto lens, but it kind of makes up for it because it's not exactly that big or that heavy. The images I was getting from this lens was by far the best of the 3 when it came to video. The colors and detail were like no lens I've ever used. Now let's take a look at the 35mm prime. The biggest plus I have for this thing is how tiny it is. I mean, this thing is really tiny. It's like a pancake lens, but for DSLRs, mirrorless cameras. It's kind of that mirrorless technology is why they're able to make it so small. It comes with a recessed hood, which is cool, so you don't have a hood sticking out. It's still effective. And it's very sharp at the center for a wide lens, and it has minimal vignetting, which is, like I said, surprising for such a wide lens. Well, 35mm isn't so wide, but it's wide enough. It has very fast autofocus, especially for mirrorless. A lot of people have been complaining that mirrorless don't focus fast enough. They're not good sports photography cameras, and that's true, but this thing is very, very fast compared to the other 2 lenses. The one caveat, actually there's 2, is how expensive this is. It's $800. It's definitely overpriced. And on that same note, it only stops down to f2.8. If this stopped down to f about 2.0, like my other 35mm Canon I had, I'd say it'd definitely be worth the price tag. But at only f2.8, I'd say this is probably more of a $600 lens. So it's up to you whether or not you think it's worth the extra $200. I really love this lens for the on-the-go photography. The size and weight works very well with my small camera body, plus it focuses very fast compared to the other 2. So let's take a look at the 24-70 zoom. This is actually a constant aperture f4 lens, and it's actually an upgrade from the kit lens, which isn't constant aperture. It has OSS, which is awesome for image stabilization for your videos or even photography. It has a very smooth zoom, which is key. The Canon ones I was using before, you could hardly pull off a dolly move. It was very, very hard to get it smooth, and if not impossible. This one is definitely easier to zoom with. And all 3 of these lenses actually have very smooth focuses, and they have what's called a variable focus, and it could be good or bad. It kind of depends on the situation, but for the amateur or the semi-professional, it's very good because it kind of helps you get the smoother focus pulls, though it's not it might not get exactly what you want because it's kind of guessing where you're going with your focus pull. It's much smaller. This lens is much smaller than the other 24 to 70 zooms you're going to see out there, especially the Canon one. The Canon one's huge and about 4 times the weight. It's insane. This lens is not as sharp at 24 and 70, which, it's a little bit nitpicky, but it's definitely not as sharp, especially not as the primes. And it's a little bit overpriced too. It's $1,200. It's the most expensive one of the 3. And the only reason I got this one is because I was able to get it used on B&H Photo for $950, so it was $250 off. And I just immediately pulled the trigger. And this lens has only been out for 3 months. It couldn't have been used that much, and when I got it, it was perfectly fine. So that's why I went for this one. The best part about this lens is the convenience. When I'm walking around town filming things or taking stills, having a zoom with OSS and multiple focal lengths can be a lifesaver. Here's a shot comparing the 3 lenses handheld, and you can see a huge difference with the 24 to 70. Even zoomed in to 70mm, it is much more fluid than the other 2. Okay, so I ran some basic tests on these lenses, mainly focusing on framing and what f-stop these lenses are sharpest at. I'll briefly talk about vignetting, but that only really matters for photography because in video we actually only use so much of the frame. Vignetting can occur on wider lenses, particularly near the corners, but since when we shoot video the top and bottom get chopped off, mild vignetting doesn't really affect your image that much. Let's start with my favorite lens, the 55mm prime. You're going to see the best results in terms of sharpness and vignetting at around f4.0 to f9.0. I usually shoot at f5.6 as a baseline when doing short films. Taking a look at a picture from this brick wall, we can see that the lens is incredibly sharp from the middle to pretty much the edge. Vignetting is also very respectable with little distortion. If you're taking photos with this lens and getting any kind of vignetting, I suggest shooting between f8 and f11, though you will lose a bit of sharpness. On to the next lens, the 35mm prime. This lens is sharpest at around f5.6, but doesn't have the same sharpness throughout like the 55mm. I started noticing a loss of detail at around f5 and below f4, so it's definitely not as flexible as the 55. This lens also has twice the distortion near the corners compared to the 55mm, which is to be expected from a wider lens and won't be as noticeable unless you're shooting symmetrical objects like this wall here. Also, the vignetting on this lens is pretty bad across the board, but definitely avoid f2.8 if you're having serious issues with photos. But like I said before, this isn't that big of a deal for videographers, but at the end of the day, this is a very compact lens that while it isn't as high quality in terms of image quality as my 55, I definitely use this lens more with this camera just because it's so small. Now let's take a look at the 24 to 70. Now this is actually the last lens I picked up because for the price, it was getting some pretty disturbing reviews considering the image quality. But to be honest, I've been really happy with it thus far. I think this might have something to do with the people reviewing these lenses using something like the Sony a7R, which has 3 times the pixels as my a7s. So it allows them to nitpick much more, especially when it comes to photos. This lens definitely has some distortion issues at both 24 and 70mm, and is not as sharp at the center as the other 2 at any focal length. But as far as videos go, I don't think most people will notice any difference, and with the convenience of the zoom and the OSS, I think this makes a great lens to pick up. Some of the other lenses rumored to come out within the next year include some wider and more telephoto primes, faster lenses for focal lengths already available, probably bigger in my estimation, a very intriguing 28 to 130mm zoom with OSS and power zoom. Now many of you may be hesitating to jump into the full frame mirrorless E-mount glass, and as more lenses come out, I think more people will begin to take this system seriously. But in my opinion, I absolutely love the glass currently available, mostly due to the compact size in combination with the mirrorless bodies. After all, they say the best camera is the one that you have with you. And to be honest, I never really took my 5D places that often because of the sheer size of that thing. And yes, people will point out that these lenses aren't f1.4 and so they're not that big. But I gotta tell you, if you're using the a7s, does it really matter? You're mostly gonna wanna shoot at f5.6 anyways if you wanna get the film look and you wanna have the best sharpness on these lenses. And you could just use the ISO on the crazy a7s to compensate. I've actually been really impressed with the image quality of this camera with the lenses available. I think I was a bit worried about stepping down from my 21 megapixel 5D Mark II all the way down to the 12 megapixel a7s. But for what I'm using this camera for, such as uploading straight to the internet or printing normal size prints, the 12 megapixels is really more than you need. And I think the biggest plus is that you get 15 stops of dynamic range when you're shooting RAW, which is perfect for on-the-go photography like I do. If I miss an exposure, I can easily fix it in post. But that's it for this week. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below or send them to our Twitter page at Filmin5D or on our Facebook wall at this link right here. We'll be back next time with another episode on the a7s, and we'll be starting our weekly podcast in September.